In 2020, the United States government decided to move money fast. A pandemic was shutting down schools. Children who depended on free meals had nowhere to eat. So the federal government opened the tap, emergency funding, distributed through nonprofits, minimal paperwork, almost no verification. It was the right call. Children needed food and they needed it now. What happened next is a story about what that urgency made possible. A woman named Amy Bach ran a nonprofit in Minnesota called Feeding Our Future. On paper, it was a child nutrition program. It received federal money to reimburse meals served to children during the pandemic. Except the meals were never cooked, never served, and never eaten. Between 2020 and 2022, Feeding Our Future submitted claims for $250 million in federal reimbursements. The money flowed through more than 200 entities, shell companies, fake sites, businesses that existed only on paper. The scale was industrial. At its peak, the program was claiming to serve tens of thousands of meals a day at locations that had no kitchens, no staff, and in some cases no building. Nobody checked. 70 people were indicted. 63 have been convicted, 57 guilty pleas, 6 at trial. The ringleader, Amy Bach, was convicted in March 2025 on 7 counts including wire fraud. She faces up to 33 years in prison. Her sentencing is scheduled for May 2026. And during the trial, when the evidence started pointing toward conviction, something extraordinary happened. Someone left a bag containing $120,000 in cash on a juror's doorstep. A bribe during a federal trial, $120,000 in a bag. 5 people pleaded guilty to jury tampering. But Feeding Our Future was not an isolated case. It was the largest, but it was running alongside at least 13 other programs that were hemorrhaging money at the same time. Take Autism Services. Minnesota has a Medicaid program that funds therapy for children with autism, a legitimate, necessary program. A 28-year-old woman named Asha Farhan Hassan ran a clinic called Smart Therapy Center. Between 2019 and 2024, it billed Medicaid for $14 million. The staff providing the therapy were 18 and 19 years old with no medical qualifications whatsoever. Families were recruited with cash kickbacks, $300 to $1,500 a month, to enroll their children in treatments that never took place. The children received nothing. The money disappeared. And Smart Therapy Center wasn't alone. 14 Medicaid autism and behavioral service programs are now under audit. Then there was housing. Minnesota runs a Medicaid program called Housing Stabilisation Services. It was designed to help seniors, disabled people, and those with substance abuse disorders find stable housing. In 2020, the program cost $2.5 million a year. By 2024, it cost over $100 million. Federal regulators shut it down entirely in October 2025. Their description, and this is their language, not ours, was that the program was riddled with fraud. 8 people were charged in September 2025, 5 more in December, including 2 from Pennsylvania. Investigators described them as fraud tourists, people who traveled across state lines specifically to exploit a program they'd identified as vulnerable. In December 2025, the U.S. Attorney for Minnesota did something unusual. He added it all up. Across all 14 high-risk programs, child nutrition, autism therapy, housing, personal care, he arrived at a single number. $9 billion. The governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, called that estimate sensationalized. He may be right, the number is disputed. It may include overlap, it may include legal costs, it may reflect the upper bound of a range. But even the most conservative reading of the evidence shows fraud in the billions, across programs that were supposed to feed children, treat disabled people, and house the vulnerable. And most of it went undetected for years. Now, There is a number in the federal filings that most people reporting on this story either bury or skip entirely. The U.S. Attorney reported that of the 92 people indicted across these fraud cases, 82 were Somali American. That is not our number. That is not a commentator's number. It is the federal prosecutor's own figure, published in December 2025. And it demands care. It does not mean that a community is criminal. Minnesota is home to the largest Somali diaspora in the United States. The overwhelming majority are exactly what the immigration system intended them to be: people who fled a civil war, who rebuilt their lives, who are raising families and running businesses. That is the truth, and it should be said first. But it is also true that a specific set of individuals exploited the trust that their own community had earned. They used community networks to recruit families into the schemes. They used cultural and language barriers to shield the operations from outside scrutiny. And they operated for years before anyone in authority looked closely enough to notice. The biggest victims of a $250 million child feeding fraud are children who didn't get fed. The biggest victims of a fraudulent autism program are autistic children who didn't get treatment. And the biggest victims of the housing fraud are disabled people who didn't get housed. The people who were hurt most by these schemes are the families in the Somali American community who were recruited into them, who now face an entire community's reputation being shaped by the actions of a few dozen criminals, who will find it harder to access legitimate services for years because of what was done in their name. There is a version of this story that treats the demographic data as unspeakable, too sensitive to mention, too dangerous to discuss. And there is a version that treats it as the whole story, that flattens an entire community into a headline. Both versions are dishonest. The first prevents accountability, the second prevents justice. What the data actually shows is something more specific and more uncomfortable than either framing allows. A small number of people identified a vulnerability in the American welfare system, emergency-era spending with almost no oversight, and exploited it systematically at a scale that dwarfs most fraud cases in the country's history. They did this within community structures that were designed to help refugees integrate, and they turned those structures into instruments of theft. The federal government processed the claims. The state government wrote the checks. And when the scale of it became impossible to ignore, the governor ordered an audit and hired 150 temporary auditors. Temporary for a $9 billion problem. Minnesota spent decades building one of the most generous refugee resettlement systems in the country. It worked. Most of the people it brought in built lives, started businesses, raised families. That is the baseline, and it should not be forgotten. But generosity without accountability is not compassion. It is negligence. And when negligence operates at this scale, $9 billion, 14 programs, years of ignored warnings, calling it a failure of oversight is too generous. Oversight implies someone was trying to see. Nobody was trying to see. They were trying not to. The programs haven't been redesigned. The emergency spending model hasn't changed. The guardrails that were removed during the pandemic have not been reinstalled. And the next crisis, the next pandemic, the next disaster, the next time a government needs to move money faster than it can verify where it's going, will use the same template. $9 billion disappeared in Minnesota. Not because the system was broken by outsiders, because it was left open by the people who built it and found by the people who knew it best. That is not a story about immigration. It is not a story about one community. It is a story about what happens when a government builds a door without a lock, and then acts surprised when someone walks through it. If this changed how you see your next receipt, your next bill, your next upgrade, we did our job. Like and subscribe, we have more to show you.